Andrea Morante, you're Chief Executive of Pomellato. What's it like being an Italian businessman at the moment? Because we also, of course, talk about Italy being in the eye of the storm. We're now talking about Spain and needing, of course, this extra help. It's all very difficult, I imagine, also to get funding.
Yes, I would have thought that the consequences as far as the business is concerned is twofold. Number one, you obviously have a market which is starting to resent very seriously, and demand is decreasing, and therefore the consumption patterns are changing. That's number one. And number two, when you actually go and talk to banks, it's very complicated. You spend a lot of time trying to convince them, trying to make your case. And we have a pretty good case, so you know, we get what we want, but it's not obviously always the case. And I can imagine what a nightmare it is for many of our other competitors.
Yeah.
As an Italian businessman, do you anticipate that Italy will ultimately fall under the same umbrella that Spain looks like it's now going to?
Well, I would have thought not so far, on the basis at least of the evidence that there is so far, because there is an industrial platform in Italy. There is sort of a northern Italy, which is a very strong component of the European economy. And I think that that significant component of the economy will help weather the storm.
Andrea, you know, here we're trying to really understand on City Central also how the chief executives are prepare for a possible Greek exit. Does Pomellato have any plans in place? I mean, how is someone going to buy their jewelry? Is there going to be an exchange? Are you taking contingency plans?
Okay. I'm sure that larger companies that are exposed to these type of sort of impacts have to, and I hope they do have a contingency plan. As far as we're concerned, our contingency plan is to keep cool. We're keeping cool. We're trying to produce as much and as best we can, and obviously take advantage of every market in the world to reduce our dependency and our exposure to the European market. So the one reaction that we have is a need to go away from Europe and to try and find revenues outside of Europe.
How would you rate Mario Monti, marks out of 10?
7 out of 10. I would say for two reasons. Number one, because the previous government would have had a considerably lower rating. And the second reason is that he's fighting a mission which is quite complicated. He's got the politicians pretty much not totally aligned with him. And it's very difficult to govern a country when you've got the politicians that don't want to prove necessarily that you are successful. If by any chance the Italian government, the current, which is a technocrat government, should be successful, it would be a big failure for the politicians, and therefore they're very edgy as to whether this success can be justified or not.
It does seem that certainly a lot of the luxury companies and a lot of Italian companies are looking at the emerging markets to actually capture that growth. How difficult is it going to be in general for companies like yourselves in Europe over the next 5 years?
Well, the issue is an acceleration issue. In other words, you have to accelerate what before you thought you could do within a shorter or reasonable period of time now has to be accelerated. So you have to try and create the awareness of your brand. You have to try and create new markets under a mode which is a quick mode. And that sometimes can lead to errors, it can lead to mistakes, and therefore that's the only risk that I see currently.
David, you know, you've also spent some time in Italy looking at, I remember the story we had that it was a national...
I was actually just recently in Florence where I interviewed the CEO of Ferragamo. And I thought it was very interesting what he was talking about in terms of his sales to the Chinese, because Europe is such a big market for the Chinese. He was talking about the efforts that countries like Italy could make in order to improve their infrastructure, airports, that sort of thing, in order to encourage more Chinese to in fact go to Italy rather than go through other ports. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I entirely agree with that, because it was pretty obvious like 5 years ago that the Chinese were going to start traveling extensively, not only in Europe, around the world. And therefore the issue was very clearly, where are these customers going to be going? Which airport of entry will they be utilizing? And what will be their pattern of voyage in Europe? Okay? And it's very interesting to see that, for example, initially most of them were going to Germany, which you would have thought is not the perfect or the ideal location from a touristic perspective. But since the German and Chinese link are very strong, that link, airway link, has been so successful that it has led to Chinese traveling extensively to Germany. Now they're going more to Paris, and from Paris they're going to Switzerland, and they're also going to Italy. But you know, you're absolutely right. The infrastructure to allow people to come in and to make the experience user-friendly is absolutely necessary.
Yes. Andrea, you have said, of course, in the past that you were looking to IPO the company in possibly as soon as 2013, if I'm not mistaken. Has anything changed in your plans? I mean, it seems very difficult out there. Shareholders are becoming more and more difficult.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt that the investor base is changing, and it's changing quite rapidly. But having said that, you know, the IPO is obviously one way of raising money. And the one thing that you have to do today is perhaps to have the flexibility of having multiple options in front of you. One option continues to be the IPO exit, but there's also, you know, private equity, there is sales, directly strategic sales. So you have to assume that things will change for the best. The current markets today perhaps are not certainly perfect in terms of IPOing a company, but you know, they could change quite rapidly over the next 12 to 18 months.
Why do you need the money? Talk to me about the investment strategy, what that cash would be used for, what the end game here is with this business, and kind of how you are developing it.
Yeah. I was mentioning before that there is a need of an acceleration in terms of developing in certain parts of the world where we're not present and where we would like to be present. And that acceleration normally is associated with the need of funding. And the need of funding is principally to A, open new doors, new direct doors, and they tend to be expensive, especially in cities where it's very competitive to find the right location, and the right location can be the name of the game in certain parts of the world. So the bulk of the money is really needed to open new doors and establish through advertising and through other forms of educating the final consumer to try to establish a better awareness for Pomellato, which in some countries is not necessarily the case.
So how much is advertising and actually awareness important? We had some figures from Prada today, and that they, you know, smashed estimates because it is something that is very well recognized, and so people buy into that desirability.
Yes. Well, the Prada case story is obviously a success case story in many respects. But if I had to single out the one feature that really led them to this particular type of positive results, is the fact that even when things were rough in 2008, they kept on investing and following a specific strategy to reduce their wholesale dependence and increase their retail, direct retail access. And that is proving extremely successful on the basis and on the background of a brand which is very creative, and which not only is Prada, but it's also Mio Mio. So it's a successful story in many respects.
The luxury sector, the jewelry sector in particular, is not well penetrated by brands. There are only few of them. They mainly come out of Europe. That is going to change over the next few years. You've got a brand. Presumably you've got a window of opportunity.
Well, you're absolutely right, because the overall market of the jewelry industry is roughly 160, 170 billion around the world. So it's pretty much the same size of the luxury industry itself. And of that 160 billion, there's only 5 or 6% which is branded jewelry. So that means that really out of 100 pieces of jewelry sold in a day, only 7 are branded. The bulk is all non-branded. So that obviously represents a huge opportunity for those companies who are already pretty well established within the jewelry industry with their own brand. But it also represents a unique opportunity for other companies in the luxury industry who are not necessarily currently doing a jewelry activity, but they very well be tempted to do it in the future.
Are you seeing more and more companies being afraid to IPO, given what's happened with Facebook and also Graph pulling out of its IPO?
I think at the moment the IPO market is a really challenging place. If you're a CEO of a company that's considering an IPO, what you want to know is that you launch a process and that process completes at a price and a valuation that you're attracted to. What investors in IPOs don't like is uncertainty, and we clearly have a lot of that at the moment. Facebook hasn't helped.
That was a pure pricing issue. It's not that the business wasn't attractive, it's that it was at the wrong price.
Completely agree with that, but what it has done is it stifled the activity in the IPO market in the US, and the US capital markets are clearly a very strong barometer for the rest of the world's capital markets. And since that time, since Facebook listed, we haven't had any further IPOs coming to the market in the US.
Is an IPO now a less attractive option? Regulation is rising, shareholder activism is growing. There are better ways to raise money, aren't there?
there are different ways to raise money. One of the key attractions of the IPO is to get access to the capital markets. If you have the right story, the right growth story, the right company, a very strong management team, a strong brand, for example, you should be able to access the capital markets, and that's the key reason for you being there. Increasingly for companies on the markets, that access is not available, and therefore they need to think about other options. To look at just the public markets, you're comparing them also to the debt markets, and they're tight at the moment as well, so it's a challenge.
And Andrea, how concerned are you that, I mean, if you were to go ahead with the IPO, is it absolutely crucial that you have to get the pricing right, especially in this kind of environment where we're seeing the European debt crisis and so many IPOs have failed or not come onto the market because they probably weren't priced at a ratio that, buoyed investor appetite?
Well, obviously the pricing is an important component of an IPO, and therefore you set yourself a range within which you want to operate. But I think that under these circumstances, if you really wanted to push ahead for the IPO, you would have to be particularly conscious and attentive to flexibility on the pricing front. And therefore, you would obviously have to accept that the investor has more power under the current circumstances.
Andrea, just hold that thought, because we're just getting some breaking news out of Spain. The Spain economy minister saying that they have now put in place the bank audit plan. So they've hired Deloitte, PwC, Ernst & Young, KPMG, and that first audit result will be on July 31st. So it does seem like certainly something's moving. Yeah,
I think the situation may, by the sounds of things, have moved on a little bit by then.
Maybe. Possibly.
If we've already got a bank bailout package in place.
Yeah. Andrea, how important is it that actually this is sorted by the time that you have an IPO?
Well, I guess that under the current circumstances, nobody would venture an IPO. Therefore, in our specific case, we would probably, look at early 2014 at this stage as a period most normal to consider the IPO venture. But as you were saying, you have to look at the circumstances, the window. We know the window of the IPOs opens and closes, and therefore you have to adjust to the circumstances, I guess.
The lack of IPOs clearly affects the private equity market because exits are limited.
Yeah.
Is the lack of IPOs holding back biz dev, business development in Europe at this stage? How much a significant factor is it? You talk about the need for capital. Are banks restricting capital? Is there a demand shortage at the moment? Just to walk us through what impact this is having in terms of businesses moving forward in Europe, or is it having no impact whatsoever?
Oh, clearly businesses are going to be a lot more cautious. The availability of funding is more challenging, it's more limited. As I previously mentioned, the credit markets continue to be tight. So therefore, any strategic investment that is going to take place has to be very well considered.
But any good businesses, as we've just been hearing, can get capital?
Should be able to, yes.
Yeah.
But there's a price impact on that capital at the moment.
Is there a price impact on the capital? Is there a capital shortage affecting your business? You say no.
Well, there is depending on what you want to do. I mean, obviously with the capital, with an IPO, you could accelerate, as I was explaining before, your growth.
Right.
Because you would have more funds available to do all the things that you couldn't do otherwise with your own cash flow. So the IPO market remains a very important potential instrument for growth. There's no doubt about that.